The Zelthari Empire had ruled the outer regions of the galaxy for 3,000 years, and their way of war was simple and brutal. They would find a new species that was just learning to travel between stars, and they would attack without warning. The attack was always the same. A massive fleet would appear in orbit around the homeworld and fire enough weapons to destroy a few cities and military bases. Then they would send a message demanding complete surrender within 1 hour. Every species they encountered would see the destruction and realize they had no chance of winning. Every species would surrender. 47 worlds had fallen to this strategy, and the Zelthari expected the 48th to fall just as easily. Earth was supposed to be number 48, and the Zelthari had no reason to think humans would be any different from the others. They sent 300 warships, and they felt confident. This was more than enough to frighten the primitive species into submission. Commander Kyle Morrison stood on the bridge of the CSS Defender and watched his detection screen fill with red dots. The Defender was humanity's first real warship capable of deep space travel, and Kyle had been proud to command it. Now he wondered if his ship would survive the next few hours. Lieutenant Amy Peterson ran the sensor data 3 times. Before she trusted what she was seeing, she turned to Kyle with wide eyes and said the ship was detecting 300 unknown vessels entering orbit around Earth. The configuration matched nothing in their database, and the energy reading suggested weapons technology far beyond anything humanity had developed. Kyle felt his stomach tighten, but he kept his voice calm and ordered Amy to hail the unknown ships and attempt communication. The response came faster than expected, and it was broadcast in perfect English. The voice was cold and mechanical, and somehow managed to sound both bored and condescending at the same time. The message stated that the Zelthari Empire now claimed Earth and all human territories. Humanity had exactly 1 hour to surrender completely or face what they called corrective bombardment. The transmission ended before Kyle could respond. He immediately contacted Earth Command, and within minutes, President Laura Bennett had convened an emergency session with military leaders and scientific advisors. Everyone in the room understood the situation. Earth had 6 orbital defense platforms and 12 warships that could barely reach the moon. The enemy had 300 ships that had crossed the galaxy. The odds were impossible. Some advisors argued for surrender and claimed that resistance would only lead to more deaths. Others insisted that surrendering to an alien empire without even trying to fight would doom humanity to slavery. The debate lasted 30 minutes, and Laura listened to every voice. Then she made her decision and gave the order that would change everything. She told them to send a message refusing surrender, and to scramble every ship and weapon humanity possessed. The Zelthari response was immediate and devastating. Plasma weapons rained down from orbit targeting military installations across 6 continents. The bombardment lasted exactly 12 minutes, and when it ended, 17,000 humans were dead. Cities burned and military bases were reduced to smoking craters. The Zelthari waited for Earth to send the surrender message. Instead, every remaining human ship began accelerating toward the Zelthari fleet. Commander Velkoth led the Zelthari forces, and he stared at his tactical display in confusion. His species had conquered 47 worlds, and never once had the primitive species attacked after seeing a demonstration of superior firepower. He turned to his tactical officer and asked if the sensors were malfunctioning. The officer confirmed that every human vessel was indeed moving to engage despite having no chance of victory. Velkoth ordered his ships to destroy the attacking humans quickly because the fleet had a schedule to maintain. The Zelthari opened fire and several human ships exploded immediately, but the remaining vessels scattered in different directions and launched thousands of small missiles. The Zelthari weapons destroyed most of the missiles easily, but a few dozen made it through. Then something strange happened. The missiles did not target Zelthari ships at all. Instead, they detonated across a wide area of space, creating a massive debris field between Earth and the fleet. Velkoth demanded to know what the humans were doing, and his officer explained that the debris would take at least 3 days to clear safely. The human ships had already retreated behind Earth's moon and were no longer visible on sensors. Velkoth felt something he rarely experienced. He felt confused. The humans had sacrificed ships to create a temporary barrier that would accomplish nothing except delaying the inevitable. On Earth, Lieutenant Amy Peterson allowed herself a brief smile. Kyle had ordered the suicide mission himself, and every pilot had volunteered. They bought humanity 3 days to prepare, and now Earth would use every second. Kyle looked at the countdown timer on his screen and spoke quietly. He said the Zelthari had made a mistake by giving humanity time to think. He said they made an even bigger mistake by killing 17,000 people and expecting the rest to surrender. He said the aliens clearly did not understand what humans do when someone attacks their home and kills their families. Amy asked what humans do, and Kyle smiled. He said humans get angry, and when humans get angry, they stop following the rules. The Zelthari thought they were following standard procedure, but they just declared war on a species that had spent its entire evolution fighting everything on a death world. They attacked a species that had survived ice ages and plagues and world wars. They hit a species that invented nuclear weapons and then built more because the first ones were not destructive enough, deep underground in a facility that did not officially exist. Dr. Helen Carter worked with 300 engineers on projects that had been theoretical yesterday. Colonel Jake Harrison stood beside her and asked how long until the new weapons were ready. Helen did not look up from her computer and said the factories were converting civilian production lines to military hardware. Every car factory was now building missiles. Every electronics manufacturer was producing targeting systems. Every person with technical skills was working 20-hour shifts. Jake asked about the experimental weapons, and Helen pulled up a classified file. She explained that Project Linebacker was a massive railgun that would launch telephone pole-sized projectiles from Earth's surface into orbit. Project Hammer was a shaped nuclear device designed to punch through energy shields. Project Goodbye was something else entirely, and Helen said the engineers called it wildly irresponsible and absolutely terrifying. The president had approved all 3 projects immediately. Kyle Morrison stood on the bridge of the Defender and looked at his crew. The ship was designed for 300 people but now held 800. More personnel arrived every hour via shuttle. They were overcrowded and undersupplied, and facing an enemy with superior technology and numbers. Command wanted to know if the Defender was ready for combat. Amy stood and activated a video compilation, showing engineers welding armor plates onto the hull and weapons, officers drilling reload procedures, and pilots running combat simulations in continuous shifts. At the end, someone had added text that read, "They were not trapped in orbit with the Zelthari. The Zelthari were trapped in orbit with them." Kyle felt something fierce rise in his chest and ordered Amy to send that message to command. He said to tell them the Defender was ready to hunt. The Zelthari detected the Defender too late. Kyle had hidden his ship in the debris field using the moon for cover and waited for a straggler. When a Zelthari frigate separated from the main fleet to investigate an anomaly, the Defender struck. Railgun rounds accelerated to incredible speed, tore through the alien ship's shields and hull in seconds. The frigate exploded, and by the time Zelthari reinforcements arrived, the Defender had vanished into the asteroid belt. Commander Velkoth stared at the wreckage and felt something new. He felt concerned. These humans were not following proper procedure, and they showed no fear despite being completely outmatched. He made a decision and sent a message to the Admiralty requesting reinforcements. His report stated that the humans were not behaving according to normal patterns of conquest. On Earth, President Laura Bennett received the battle report about the destroyed Zelthari frigate and allowed herself one moment of satisfaction. Then she addressed the United Assembly and told them the Zelthari thought one strike would break humanity. She said they were wrong. She said Earth was going to teach the galaxy something important. She said humans do not surrender and humans do not quit. She said humanity adapts and improvises and hits back twice as hard. The war had begun, and Earth would show these aliens what happens when you attack a species too stubborn to know when they should give up. The Zelthari Empire had a concept they called Kelshara, which roughly meant the proper order of warfare. The idea was simple and had worked for thousands of years. You demonstrated overwhelming power, and the enemy saw they could not win, and they surrendered to avoid pointless deaths. Peace would return, and the conquered species would join the empire. The system had worked perfectly on 47 worlds, and Commander Velkoth expected it to work on Earth as well. He had bombarded their cities and destroyed their military installations and waited for the surrender message. 60 hours later, he was still waiting, and Velkoth could not understand what was happening. His communications officer reported that the humans had rejected the surrender terms again. This time, the human leader had sent only 2 words in response. The message said, "Try harder." Velkoth felt something close to anger, which was unusual for his species. He ordered a damage assessment of human military capabilities to understand why they refused to accept the inevitable. The holographic display showed that 32% of human orbital defenses had been destroyed and 19% of ground military installations were neutralized. These were significant losses and should have convinced any rational species to surrender. But the officer hesitated before continuing, and Velkoth demanded to know what else the sensors showed. The officer explained that construction activity on Earth had increased by 400% since the bombardment. The humans were not hiding or preparing to surrender. They were building more weapons and mobilizing their entire population for war. Deep underground, beneath the mountains of Colorado, Dr. Helen Carter studied manufacturing output reports and shook her head in disbelief. The numbers seemed impossible, but every factory on Earth confirmed them. Beside her, Colonel Jake Harrison reviewed deployment schedules for new weapon systems. He asked Helen how long until the first batch of railgun platforms would be operational. Helen did not look away from her screens and said the factories were running 24 hours every day. She said they would have 50 new platforms ready in 6 days, and civilian manufacturing facilities were being converted at rates that broke every previous record. Jake asked about the experimental weapons programs, and Helen pulled up classified files. She explained that Project Linebacker was ahead of schedule, and the massive railgun would be ready to fire within a week. Project Hammer was showing promising results in testing and might actually work despite being designed in just 3 days. Project Goodbye had been approved for field testing, even though the scientists called it insane. Jake raised an eyebrow and asked what Project Goodbye was. Helen smiled and said he would see soon enough. She said the engineers described it as wildly irresponsible and absolutely terrifying, and the president had signed the authorization papers immediately after reading the proposal. Aboard the CSS, Defender Kyle Morrison met with his officers in the cramped ready room. The ship had been designed for 300 personnel, but now held 800, and more arrived every hour. They were overcrowded and running low on supplies and facing an enemy that outgunned them in every category. Command had sent a message asking if the Defender was truly ready for extended combat operations. Kyle looked at his exhausted crew and asked if anyone wanted to return to Earth. Lieutenant Amy Peterson stood first and said she had a message from the crew for command. She activated a screen showing video footage compiled over the past 3 days. The video showed engineers welding additional armor plates onto the hull, and weapons officers practicing reload procedures until they could do it blindfolded. It showed pilots running combat simulations in shifts with no breaks, and technicians repairing damage faster than should be possible. At the end, someone had edited in text that said the crew was not trapped in orbit with the Zelthari. The text said the Zelthari were trapped in orbit with humans. Kyle felt pride swell in his chest and ordered Amy to send that video to command. He said to tell them the Defender was ready to hunt. The Zelthari frigate Keltarath was performing a routine patrol sweep when sensors detected unusual readings near the asteroid belt. The captain ordered an investigation because standing orders required all anomalies to be checked. The frigate moved closer to investigate and never saw the attack coming. The Defender had been hiding among the asteroids using the rocks to mask its energy signature. Kyle had positioned his ship perfectly and waited with the patience of a predator. He gave the order to fire, and the Defender's railguns launched depleted uranium slugs at a significant fraction of light speed. The Zelthari shields were designed to stop energy weapons and explosive missiles. They did almost nothing against solid metal projectiles moving at hypersonic velocity. The slugs punched through the shields and tore through the hull and ripped the frigate apart in seconds. Secondary explosions destroyed what remained, and by the time other Zelthari ships detected the attack, the Defender had already retreated into the asteroid belt. Commander. Velkoth received the report and stared at the image of debris that had been the Keltarath. His tactical officer confirmed that a single human vessel had destroyed a Zelthari frigate and escaped without being identified. Velkoth asked how this was possible, and the officer had no explanation. The humans were using tactics that made no sense. They sacrificed valuable ships to create debris fields, and they hid among asteroids like pirates instead of fighting honorably. Velkoth made a decision that would later cost him his command. He composed a message to the Admiralty requesting immediate reinforcements, and explained that these humans were not behaving according to any known pattern. On Earth, President Laura Bennett received the battle report and read it twice before believing it. A single human ship had destroyed an enemy frigate and survived. She called an emergency meeting and stood before the United Assembly with the report in her hand. She told them the Zelthari thought one bombardment would break human resistance. She said they were wrong, and now humanity would teach the entire galaxy an important lesson. She said humans do not surrender when attacked. She said humans adapt and improvise and overcome. She said Earth would hit back twice as hard as any blow received. The news spread across Earth within hours, and something changed in the global population. The initial shock and fear after the bombardment transformed into cold anger. Factories increased production again. Volunteers lined up at recruiting stations faster than the military could process them. Scientists worked around the clock on weapons that had been theoretical concepts just days before. Humanity was mobilizing for total war, and the Zelthari had no idea what was coming. 3 weeks after the initial attack, the Zelthari returned in force. The Admiralty had decided to teach the humans a proper lesson and dispatched the 6th and 9th battle groups. 800 warships emerged from faster-than-light travel near Jupiter and began their approach to Earth. Admiral Kreshtar commanded the fleet, and he was confident this overwhelming show of force would finally convince the humans to accept reality. Lieutenant Amy Peterson detected the new fleet and reported to Captain Kyle Morrison. She said sensors were tracking 800-plus vessels moving in formation toward Earth. The configuration matched Zelthari battle groups, and the energy signatures suggested these were frontline military ships. Kyle studied the tactical display and asked for the status of the home fleet. Amy reported that humanity had 270 vessels ready for combat. The new railgun platforms were online and tracking targets. Ground-based laser arrays were charged and waiting for targets to come in range. Kyle did the math quickly and realized they were outnumbered nearly 3-1. He asked Amy to signal the fleet and implement Operation Angry Hornet. The plan was risky and violated every standard military doctrine, but humans had stopped caring about proper tactics. Amy sent the signal, and across the solar system, human ships began accelerating toward the incoming enemy fleet. Admiral Kreshtar watched the human response with confusion. His tactical officer reported that all human vessels were accelerating directly toward the Zelthari fleet. Kreshtar asked if the sensors were malfunctioning, because this made no tactical sense. The officer confirmed the readings were accurate. Every human ship was charging directly at 800 Zelthari warships. Kreshtar ordered his fleet to maintain formation and prepare to destroy the attacking humans. He expected the battle to be over within an hour. Then the human fleet did something unexpected. At maximum weapons range, the formation split apart into dozens of smaller groups. Each group took a different vector and moved at different speeds. They fired missiles that released thousands of smaller submunitions. They deployed drones that flew directly at Zelthari shields and detonated on contact. Some human ships that had taken critical damage turned directly toward Zelthari vessels and used themselves as kinetic weapons. It was chaos and disorder, and completely against every principle of military tactics that the Zelthari understood. It also destroyed the carefully planned Zelthari formation. Ships broke formation to avoid collisions and pursue scattered targets. The perfect battle lines dissolved into confused fighting across millions of kilometers of space. Admiral Kreshtar watched his orderly advance turn into a sprawling mess and said something that his crew had never heard him say. The battle had been raging for 3 hours, and Admiral Kreshtar could not believe what he was seeing. His fleet of 800 warships should have crushed the human resistance within the first hour, but instead, the fighting continued across the entire solar system. The humans refused to engage in proper formation combat, and their tactics seemed designed to create maximum chaos. Zelthari ships that had trained for coordinated fleet actions found themselves fighting individual duels against human vessels that appeared from nowhere and vanished just as quickly. On Earth, Dr. Helen Carter stood beside the massive structure that had not existed 4 weeks ago. Colonel Jake Harrison stood next to her watching satellite feeds of the battle. The installation was 5 kilometers long and required an entire nuclear power plant to operate. Project Linebacker had been designed to launch cargo into orbit cheaply, but the engineers had repurposed it into a weapon. Helen monitored the power levels and reported that the electromagnetic launcher was ready to fire. Jake watched a Zelthari dreadnought break through the defensive line and begin descending toward Earth's surface. He gave the order to fire without hesitation. The launcher accelerated a solid tungsten rod to 40 kilometers per second in less than 3 seconds. The projectile was simple metal with no explosives or guidance systems. It did not need them. The physics were brutal and inescapable. The Zelthari dreadnought had shields designed to stop energy weapons and deflect explosive warheads. Those shields did absolutely nothing against a telephone pole-sized piece of metal, moving at hypersonic speed. The tungsten rod punched through the shield as if it did not exist and continued through the armor plating and hull, and out the other side. The dreadnought broke apart as its reactor lost containment and detonated. The explosion was visible from the surface. Helen reported that Project Linebacker had performed as designed, but the weapon was overheating and would need 40 minutes to cool down and reload. Jake nodded and said it was worth it because that one shot had just destroyed a ship that would have killed millions. He ordered the second launcher in China to prepare for firing. The engineers had built 3 of the massive railguns in different locations, and the Zelthari still did not know they existed in orbit. Captain Kyle Morrison guided the CSS Defender through a debris field that had been created by destroyed ships from both sides. His vessel was scarred and smoking and trailing atmosphere from multiple hull breaches, but the crew kept fighting. He had lost count of how many Zelthari ships they had engaged. Lieutenant Amy Peterson called out a warning that 3 enemy cruisers were breaking away from the main battle. She tracked their course and reported with alarm that they were heading directly for the lunar base. Kyle felt his blood run cold. The moon base housed 15,000 civilians and military personnel. His younger sister worked there as a medical officer. He ordered a pursuit course at maximum engine power. Amy checked the numbers twice and reported they could not catch the cruisers before they reached the moon. Kyle looked at his bridge crew and saw the same determination in their eyes. He said they would catch them anyway and ordered the reactor pushed past safe limits. The Defender accelerated harder than the specification said was possible. Engineering reported warnings about structural stress and reactor temperature, but Kyle ignored them all. The ship closed the distance slowly. Amy counted down the time until the cruisers would reach weapons range of the moon base. Kyle ordered every non-essential system shut down to divert power to engines and weapons. Life support reduced to minimum. Internal lights went dark. Every gram of power went to the chase. They caught the Zelthari cruisers 10,000 kilometers from the moon. Kyle ordered all weapons to fire at will, and the Defender unleashed everything it had. Railguns fired until the barrels glowed red. Missile tubes launched their entire payload in 30 seconds. Laser batteries tracked targets automatically. The experimental plasma cannon that had a 30% chance of exploding fired 3 times and somehow did not destroy the ship. The leading Zelthari cruiser took the full barrage and its shields collapsed under the concentrated fire. Secondary explosions rippled along its hull and it broke apart. The second cruiser returned fire immediately. Energy weapons struck the Defender and tore through the weakened armor plating. Explosions ripped through the port side of the ship. Alarms shrieked warnings about hull breaches on multiple decks. Amy called out casualty reports and Kyle heard the numbers without really processing them. He kept his focus on the tactical display and ordered the crew to keep firing. The second cruiser died under sustained fire from every weapon the Defender could bring to bear. The third cruiser tried to retreat and run for the safety of the main fleet. Kyle ordered missiles launched to pursue. The Defender's last functioning missile tube fired, and the weapon tracked the fleeing cruiser. The missile caught it from behind and detonated against the engines. The cruiser spun out of control and its reactor went critical. Kyle watched it explode and then asked for a damage report. Amy's voice was shaky as she read the list. They were venting atmosphere on 4 decks and 15 crew members were confirmed dead with dozens more injured. Main engines were operating at 40% capacity. Weapons batteries were down to 25% functionality. 2 entire sections of the ship had lost power completely. The Defender was barely holding together, but Amy looked up at Kyle and said the moon base was safe. Kyle allowed himself one moment to feel relief knowing his sister would survive. Then he ordered the ship to return to the fight. Admiral Kreshitar watched his tactical display and tried to understand how the battle had gone so wrong. His fleet had destroyed over 100 human vessels, but his own losses exceeded 200 ships. The humans were using tactics that violated every principle of warfare his species had developed over thousands of years.
They sacrificed valuable ships for minor tactical advantages.
They converted mining equipment and civilian vessels into weapons. They fought with a desperation and creativity that the Zelthari had never encountered. A human destroyer that had lost all weapons deliberately rammed a Zelthari cruiser at full speed and destroyed both ships. A group of human fighters used their own debris field as cover and ambushed a Zelthari squadron. A damaged human frigate flew directly into a gas giant's atmosphere, pulling 3 pursuing Zelthari ships with it. None of it made tactical sense, but all of it worked. Kreshtar realized with growing horror that his carefully planned assault had turned into a chaotic brawl, and humans were better at chaos than his species would ever be. He made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered a general withdrawal. The Zelthari fleet would retreat and regroup and plan a proper siege. His communications officer hesitated and asked if the admiral was certain. Kreshtar looked at the casualty reports and the tactical projections. If the battle continued, his fleet would win eventually through sheer numbers, but the losses would be catastrophic. He confirmed the order, and the Zelthari fleet began to disengage and retreat toward the outer system on Earth. President Laura Bennett watched the tactical display as the red dots representing enemy ships pulled back. General Jake Harrison stood beside her and confirmed that the Zelthari were retreating. Laura felt exhaustion wash over her, but she forced herself to remain standing. Around her, military officers were cheering, but she could only think about the casualty reports. Cities were burning, and the initial numbers suggested over 50,000 humans had died in this second battle. But they had won. The Zelthari had attacked with overwhelming force, and humanity had driven them back. Laura composed herself and prepared to address the planet. She walked to the communication center and stood before the cameras. Behind her, through the windows, smoke rose from damaged buildings. She did not try to hide the destruction. She wanted everyone to see what the cost had been. She spoke slowly and clearly. She said the Zelthari had come to break humanity with overwhelming force. She said they had failed. She said this war was not over and more battles would come. But today, Earth had proven something that the galaxy needed to see. She said humanity would not bow to threats or superior numbers. She said humans could not be broken by fear or intimidation. She said the enemy had tried to destroy Earth's will to fight, and instead, they had only made humanity angry. Laura continued, and her voice grew stronger. She said every human who died defending Earth would be remembered and honored. She said their sacrifice had bought time for the rest of humanity to prepare. She said the Zelthari made a mistake when they attacked Earth, because they did not understand what humans become when someone threatens their home and their families. She said they would learn that lesson the hard way. The broadcast ended and Laura sat down heavily in her chair. Jake brought her water and asked if she was all right. Laura drank and shook her head. She said she would not be all right until this war was over. She said the Zelthari would come back with even more ships, and next time humanity needed to be ready. Jake agreed and said the factories were already working on new weapons. He said Earth had 6 weeks at most before the next attack. Laura nodded and said then, they had 6 weeks to turn Earth into a fortress that even the Zelthari Empire could not crack. The Zelthari Empire convened its war council for the first time in a century, and the chamber was filled with admirals and generals who could not believe what they were hearing. Supreme Admiral Telroth reviewed the reports from the battle at Earth 3 times, because the numbers seemed impossible. 2 battle groups consisting of 800 warships had engaged a primitive species and been forced to retreat. The losses were staggering and completely unacceptable. Admiral Kreshitar stood before the council and explained that the humans fought without honor or proper military doctrine. They sacrificed ships for minimal tactical advantage and weaponized everything, including their own debris. They converted civilian mining equipment into mass drivers and used asteroids as cover for ambush attacks. Kreshtar's voice was steady, but his mandibles clicked nervously as he delivered the worst news. He said the humans were improving their combat effectiveness by approximately 12% with each engagement. They were learning and adapting faster than any species the Zelthari had ever encountered. Telroth interrupted and said this was impossible because primitive species did not learn that quickly. Kreshtar showed the combat recordings, and the council watched in silence as human ships executed tactics that made no logical sense, but somehow worked. Telroth made his decision quickly. He ordered the deployment of the Armada. 50,000 warships would travel to Earth and turn the planet to glass. The human problem would be solved permanently, and the Empire would make an example that the galaxy would never forget. But Something was happening that the Zelthari did not know about, and would not have believed if they had been told. Humanity was no longer fighting alone. The Kriath were a species the Zelthari had conquered 18 years ago and scattered across a dozen labor colonies. The Kriath resistance movement had been watching Earth's broadcasts with growing interest. They saw a primitive species bloodying the Empire's nose and using tactics that prioritized survival over tradition. They saw an opportunity, Ambassador. Nira led the Kriath government in exile, and she composed a message to Earth. Transmission was risky because the Zelthari monitored all communications, but Nira used old smuggling routes that the Empire had never discovered. The message reached President Laura Bennett's desk with a simple offer. It said the Kriath knew Zelthari weaknesses and tactical doctrine. It said they wanted to help humanity fight. It asked if Earth was interested in allies. Laura read the message twice and called an emergency meeting with her military advisors. General Jake Harrison pointed out that this could be a trap. The message might be Zelthari trying to lure humanity into revealing secrets. Laura agreed it was possible, but said they had to take the risk. Earth could not survive another battle like the last one without help. She authorized a response accepting the Kriath offer. Within days, 3 other species made contact with Earth. The Velkari had been conquered 40 years ago and still remembered freedom. The Dreshen had been fighting a guerrilla war against the Empire for a decade. The Toril had been the first species conquered by the Zelthari 3,000 years ago, and their hatred burned cold and patient. All of them had been watching Earth and waiting for someone to prove the Empire was not invincible. All of them offered help. On Earth, the transformation continued at a pace that seemed impossible. Dr. Helen Carter stood in what had been an automobile factory 8 weeks ago and now produced warships. The assembly lines that once built cars now manufactured hull plating and weapons systems. She watched as the latest vessel rolled out and told Colonel Jake Harrison they were launching 2 new ships every day. Jake asked about the special projects, and Helen smiled in a way that made him nervous. She explained that Project Hammer was now deployed on every human warship. The shaped nuclear charges could punch through Zelthari shields if detonated at close range. Project Goodbye was ready and waiting for final authorization. Project Olympus had just gone active, and Helen said they now had 3 particle beam cannons, capable of firing from Earth's surface into orbit. Jake asked how they built 3 space elevators in 2 months. Helen laughed and said, when you tell humanity to build or die, they get very creative very quickly. The Kriath arrived first with 12 ships carrying technical data and weapon specifications. Ambassador Nira met with President Laura Bennett in person, and the 2 leaders sat across from each other in a bunker deep underground. Nira was insectoid with compound eyes and clicking mandibles, but her voice was clear and determined. She told Laura that humanity's fighting spirit had impressed the Kriath, but spirit alone would not stop 50,000 ships. However, spirit combined with knowledge might give them a chance. The Kriath shared everything they knew about the Zelthari. They provided shield frequencies and formation weaknesses. They gave Earth the locations of supply depots and cloning facilities. They explained that the Zelthari were not warriors, but administrators who had conquered through intimidation. No species had ever fought back hard enough to matter. Nira said the Empire's entire military doctrine was based on enemies surrendering quickly. They had no experience with prolonged warfare against a determined opponent. Captain Kyle Morrison stood on the rebuilt bridge of the CSS Defender and barely recognized his own ship. Kriath engineers had installed new shield generators and improved the weapons targeting systems. The Velkari had contributed stealth technology that made the Defender nearly invisible to standard sensors. The Dreshen had provided advanced reactor designs that doubled the ship's power output. Kyle ran his hand along the new control panel and felt grateful for allies he had not known existed a month ago. Admiral Lisa Crawford had been promoted to lead Earth's combined defense forces after the previous admiral died in the second battle. She stood before a holographic display showing the solar system and explained the situation to her officers. The Zelthari Armada would arrive in 6 weeks with approximately 50,000 warships. Earth would have 3,000 ships by then, including vessels from their new allies. Even with superior tactics and technology, they were outnumbered more than 15 to 1. Kyle spoke up and said they could not fight the Zelthari in a direct engagement. He said they needed to make the enemy's numbers irrelevant through hit-and-run attacks on supply lines and command vessels. A Kriath tactical officer agreed, and added that the Zelthari fleet required massive logistics to function. She said if they could disrupt the supply chain, the enemy would be forced to retreat, regardless of how many ships they had. Admiral Crawford nodded and began outlining a strategy that would have been called insane a few months ago. She said humanity would not defend Earth from a fixed position. Instead, the combined fleet would scatter across the solar system and attack from every direction. They would use the asteroid belt and the moons of Jupiter as bases. They would target fuel transports and ammunition ships. They would make the Zelthari afraid to travel alone. She said they would turn the entire solar system into a hunting ground. Over the next 6 weeks, Earth transformed into something the galaxy had never seen. Orbital weapons platforms multiplied until they numbered in the thousands. The space elevators carried weapons and supplies into orbit continuously. Every human who could hold a weapon trained for combat. Every factory that could produce ammunition ran at maximum capacity. Children as young as 10 learned how to operate emergency shelters and basic first aid. The elderly worked in factories and grew food. Humanity mobilized every resource and every person for total war. But the most important project remained secret. Dr. Helen Carter stood in a facility that officially did not exist and showed President Laura Bennett the final calculations for Project Goodbye. The relativistic kill vehicle was a missile designed to accelerate to 90% of light speed. It would take 6 months to reach its target. The target was the Zelthari homeworld itself. Helen explained that once launched, there was no way to stop or recall the missile. It would travel for 6 months and then impact the Zelthari homeworld with the force of a large asteroid. The explosion would cause extinction-level damage. Laura stared at the calculations and understood what Helen was really showing her. This was not a weapon. This was revenge from beyond the grave. Laura asked what would happen if they launched and then won the war. Helen said the missile would still hit the Zelthari homeworld and kill billions of civilians who had nothing to do with the military's decisions. Laura nodded slowly and said to prepare the launch systems but not to fire without her direct authorization. She said this weapon would only be used if Earth was about to fall. She said if humanity was going to die, then the Zelthari would learn the cost of genocide. When the Zelthari armada finally arrived, it was the largest fleet ever assembled in galactic history. 50,000 warships emerged from faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. Supreme Admiral Telroth stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the tactical display with satisfaction. He had brought enough firepower to destroy 100 worlds. One primitive planet would not last the day. His sensors officer reported detecting multiple contacts around Earth. Human vessels and ships from other species were present. Telroth counted approximately 5,000 defenders and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The odds were 10. The Battle of Earth would be remembered in galactic history as the day the impossible happened, and 50,000 warships learned what it meant to fight humans who refused to surrender. Supreme Admiral Telroth had planned for a simple, overwhelming assault that would break through any defense within hours. His fleet advanced in perfect formation with shields linked and weapons charged. He expected the primitive defenders to panic when they saw the size of his armada. Instead, the human and allied fleet did something that made no tactical sense. They charged directly at the Zelthari fleet and then scattered in every direction like a school of fish avoiding a predator. The neat Zelthari formation suddenly had no clear targets. Human ships appeared from the asteroid belt firing weapons and then vanished back into the rocks. Kriath vessels used their superior sensors to guide strike groups to vulnerable command ships. Velkari stealth fighters got close enough to Zelthari dreadnoughts to launch missiles at point-blank range. Telroth watched his perfect battle plan dissolve into chaos within the first 30 minutes. He ordered his ships to maintain formation, but the humans kept forcing them to break ranks to avoid collisions or pursue attackers. Small human vessels loaded with explosives flew directly at Zelthari cruisers and detonated before they could be stopped. Automated weapons platforms hidden throughout the asteroid belt activated and fired from positions the Zelthari did not know existed. What should have been a simple massacre turned into a sprawling, confused battle across millions of kilometers on Earth. Dr. Helen Carter stood next to the massive Project Olympus installation and watched the battle through satellite feeds. General Jake Harrison gave the order to fire, and the particle beam cannon drew power from an entire nuclear reactor. The beam lanced into space and struck a cluster of Zelthari capital ships that were breaking through the defensive line. The particle beam punched through shields and armor and continued through 6 ships before the power finally dissipated. Helen reported that Olympus was overheating and would need 40 minutes to recharge. Jake said it was worth it because those 6 ships would have bombarded the surface. Captain Kyle Morrison piloted the CSS Defender through a debris field that had been created in just the first hour of combat. His ship had been upgraded with Krieth technology, but it was still taking heavy damage. Lieutenant Amy Peterson called out warnings as Zelthari weapons fire struck their shields. Commander Ryan Hayes returned fire with everything they had. The Defender was part of Strike Group Hammer, which had one mission. They were hunting Zelthari command ships and killing them before they could coordinate the massive fleet. Kyle spotted a Zelthari dreadnought that was broadcasting command signals to dozens of other ships. He ordered full acceleration toward the target, and Amy warned that 3 Zelthari cruisers were moving to intercept. Kyle said they would have to go through them first. The Defender opened fire at maximum range and the cruisers returned fire. Energy weapons and kinetic rounds filled the space between the ships. The Defender's shields took multiple hits and began to fail. Ryan launched every missile they had left and the cruisers tried to shoot them down. Most were destroyed, but enough got through to collapse the lead cruiser's shields. Kyle ordered the railguns to target the damaged ship, and depleted uranium rounds tore through the hull. The cruiser exploded and the Defender flew through the debris cloud. The second cruiser was already burning from hits by other human ships. Kyle focused on the dreadnought and ordered Ryan to prepare Project Hammer. The shaped nuclear charge had been designed specifically to punch through Zelthari shields. The Defender closed to within 5 kilometers of the dreadnought, which was dangerous range for using nuclear weapons. Kyle did not hesitate. He ordered the missile launched and then executed an emergency burn that pushed the ship's engines past their safety limits. The missile struck the dreadnought's shields and detonated. The directed nuclear blast channeled all its energy in one direction and overloaded the shield generator. The explosion punched through the armor and detonated the dreadnought's reactor. Supreme Admiral, Telroth watched his flagship's shields fail and felt the deck shake as explosions rippled through the ship. He tried to order an evacuation, but the communication system was dead. He tried to reach the escape pods, but a secondary explosion tore through the bridge. Telroth died along with 3,000 of his crew, and the command structure of the entire Zelthari armada died with him. Without central coordination, the Zelthari fleet began to falter. Individual ship captains had been trained to follow orders, not to think independently. They tried to maintain formation, but human strike groups kept targeting officers and communication relays. The neat military formation degraded into clusters of ships that could not effectively communicate with each other. Some Zelthari captains tried to press the attack. Others tried to regroup. A few tried to retreat. The confusion spread through the fleet like a virus. Admiral Lisa Crawford watched the tactical display from Earth Command and saw the Zelthari fleet losing cohesion. She ordered all human and allied forces to press the advantage. Every ship that could still fight threw themselves at the confused enemy. The Krieth targeted supply vessels carrying ammunition and fuel. The Dreshen used guerrilla tactics they had perfected over a decade of resistance. The Velkari appeared from nowhere and vanished before the Zelthari could respond. And humans kept charging forward no matter how damaged their ships were. The battle raged for 11 hours and every minute brought new horrors for both sides. Human casualties mounted as Zelthari weapons found their targets. Entire ships were vaporized. Stations were destroyed. The moon base took several hits and emergency bulkheads saved thousands, but hundreds died. Earth's surface was bombarded again and cities burned. But for every human loss, the Zelthari paid a higher price. Their ships were designed for formation warfare, not individual combat. They had better weapons and stronger shields. But humans had desperation, and creativity and the will to win at any cost. Kyle Morrison was bleeding from a head wound and his ship was held together by emergency welds and prayers. The Defender had lost main power twice and been boarded once by Zelthari soldiers. His crew had fought hand-to-hand in the corridors and somehow survived. Lieutenant Amy Peterson had a broken arm but still operated the tactical station. Commander Ryan Hayes was running weapons systems manually because the computers were damaged. Lieutenant Sophie Mitchell was dead and her replacement had been killed 10 minutes later. Kyle had taken over navigation himself. He saw a group of Zelthari ships trying to form up for another attack run on Earth. Kyle calculated the intercept course and pushed the dying engines one more time. The Defender accelerated toward the enemy formation with its shields down and half its weapons offline. Amy asked if he was planning to ram them. Kyle smiled and said only if the missiles did not work. They closed to firing range and launched their last 3 missiles. 2 were shot down, but the third got through and destroyed the lead ship. The formation broke apart. By the 15th hour of combat, the Zelthari fleet was breaking. They had lost over 30,000 ships, and the survivors were scattered and disorganized. A Zelthari admiral who had survived the death of Telroth gave an order that would echo through the Empire. He ordered a general retreat. The remaining Zelthari warships broke off combat and fled toward the outer system. Human and allied forces pursued for a while and then let them go. Everyone was too exhausted to continue. President Laura Bennett stood in the command center and watched the red dots on the tactical display retreat. General Jake Harrison stood beside her and quietly said they had won. Laura felt no joy, only exhaustion and grief. The casualty reports were still coming in, but preliminary numbers suggested 38,000 humans had died in the battle. Hundreds of thousands more were injured. Dozens of cities were damaged. The orbital infrastructure was in ruins, but Earth had survived. 3 days later, Ambassador Nira met with Laura in person. The Kriath diplomat looked tired, but her voice was strong. She said the victory had changed everything. She said resistance movements were forming on every world the Zelthari had conquered. She said the Empire's grip on the galaxy was broken. She said Earth had given every oppressed species hope that freedom was possible. Laura listened and felt the weight of responsibility. She said Earth had not wanted this war. She said humanity had only fought to survive. Nira clicked her mandibles in what might have been a smile. She said survival was enough. She said by refusing to surrender, Earth had freed the galaxy from 3,000 years of tyranny. The Zelthari Empire began to collapse over the following months. Species declared independence, and the Empire's fleet was too demoralized to stop them. Former colonies formed new alliances, and Earth found itself at the center of a growing coalition. The galaxy was changing, and humanity had sparked the revolution. Captain Kyle Morrison stood on the bridge of the rebuilt Defender and read a message from Dr. Helen Carter. She was asking about Project Goodbye. The relativistic missile was still traveling toward the Zelthari homeworld and would arrive in 3 months. Carter wanted to know if they should try to recall it. Kyle thought about the 17,000 humans who died in the first attack. He thought about the 30,